I'd like to start my remarks by briefly outlining how the Bolshevik tendency understands the current situation. For us, the recognition that Russia is not an imperialist state is central to our understanding of the current conflict. I imagine that's shared by the comrades here. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia emerged as a capitalist regional power with an economy that is primarily centered on energy exports, not the extraction of super profits from other countries. American imperialism has reneged on its assurances made to Gorbachev that there would be no NATO expansion into Eastern Europe, and has instead continued to up the ante to the point of trying to include Georgia and Ukraine in the bloc. The ultimate objective of US imperialism, expressed by Dick Cheney and among others, is to chop up Russia into several smaller, more manageable states and gain control of its immense natural resources, as Robert referred to. Since the 2014 US-sponsored right-wing Maidan coup, the various Ukrainian governments have effectively been US puppet regimes, all run from Washington. We don't think the Zelensky regime is different in that regard. We therefore regard the current war as fundamentally between US NATO imperialism and non-imperialist Russia. Unfortunately, these events have taken place in the absence of an organised revolutionary workers' movement able to pose the question of power. In this context, Marxists favour the victory of non-imperialist Russia over the Ukrainian proxy of the US NATO imperialists. The section of the left that considers Russia to be imperialist, with all the varied political content they give that term, either sides with the Ukraine and therefore US NATO, or they are neutral and call for revolutionary defeatism on both sides. There are some who regard Russia as non-imperialist, but who do not favour the victory of the Russians, like the Spartacist League and the Internationalist Group. This is ostensibly because they do not consider this a conflict essentially between the imperialists and Russia, but rather one just of capitalist Russia invading capitalist Ukraine. Then there are anarchists who argue that even if there is a distinction between imperialist and non-imperialist, it makes no difference, as they are both capitalist, although, ironically, in many cases, they side with poor, innocent Ukraine. However, what they all share in common is a failure to grasp the central importance of defeating the rapacious imperialists. The role of the fascists in Ukraine needs to be addressed, as it forms a considerable part of the narrative in the Facebook back and forth and in the mass media propaganda. Now, it is clear that the fascists were key shock troops in the 2014 coup, and as a result were able to lodge themselves inside the state apparatus, both political and military. As part of that, they played a criminal role in the 8 years of violence against the DPR and LPR breakaway republics in the Donbass, which has resulted in some 14,000 casualties. However, for us, the presence of fascists in the Ukrainian military and wider state apparatus is secondary to the role of the US-NATO imperialist military alliance. For us, the key issue for revolution in this conflict is opposing US-NATO imperialism. A related question to this is recognizing what fascism is and the danger it poses to the left and workers' movement. Ukraine provides us with valuable lessons in this regard. If, for instance, we were to compare the activity of the dangerous organised fascist formations in Ukraine to the incoherent rightist populism of Donald Trump, who riled up his base, which included a minority of fascists and other ultra-rightists, in a riot aimed at overturning the results of the US 2020 election on 6th of January 2021, I think the difference is clear. The fascistic elements in the January 6th Capitol rebuilding riot would have wanted to have come out of that process as something equivalent to the right sector and the Azov battalion and so on, following the 2014 Euromaidan protests and subsequent coup, but they did not. They were not the decisive factor in that event, and there was never any question of them having significant influence over the state machinery or even the movement itself, unlike the Azov battalion and the other formations in Ukraine who are heavily armed and organised fascists. So regarding this meeting, we view it as a small step in affirming the Bolshevik understanding of the role of imperialism in the world against the barrage of war propaganda coming out of the bourgeois mass media and our governments, for those of us that live in those countries. There is always huge pressure to adapt to prevailing forces, as we unfortunately see in the response of most of the left. It is also important to see the current conflict in the wider geopolitical context of the imperialist, particularly the US, desire to destroy the Chinese deformed worker state and open up to direct and punitive exploitation. Now, of course, the cancer of capitalist social relations has been allowed to take root, and quite deeply, in China. The bureaucrats heading the deformed worker state are playing a dangerous game, trying to contain the interest of capital while at the same time maintaining living standards of the working people. This tension will have to be resolved, and the danger of a capitalist counter-revolution is great. However, that has not happened yet, and China remains a deformed worker state which must be defended. So going back to the current conflict, from what I can tell, and there's a lot of fog of war out there, the Russians so far seem to have pretty much done what they intended to, or at least what they stated they intended to. It was all about ensuring that Ukraine will never join NATO. It was about degrading the fascistic elements within the Ukrainian military who threaten Russia. It was about solidifying and expanding the DPR and LPR to encompass most of the Donbass. It was about creating a land bridge to Crimea, and as part of that, opening up security of water supply to Crimea. Some 75,000 or so Ukrainian soldiers are now surrounded in what the Russians are calling cauldrons. And over the next week or so, those soldiers, many of them Nazi sympathizers, will either surrender or be liquidated. The Russians have effectively complete control of the air, hence the calls for NATO to enforce a no-fly zone, and could have leveled any city had they wanted to. Yet apart from Mariupol, which was a stronghold of the fascistic Azov battalion, they have attempted to minimize damage to urban areas. For instance, all the civilian infrastructure, water, electricity, heating, gas, communications, etc., remain completely operational in Kiev and Kharkiv. I don't know if people saw the Newsweek report from a American intelligence expert who was arguing this very case, that the Russians are not attacking civilians. So continuing the war will only bring more chaos and suffering for ordinary Ukrainians. The refusal of the Ukrainian government to settle the conflict by acceding to Russian proposals can only mean more needless suffering. Although, unfortunately, this seems to be exactly what the US and its NATO allies are aiming at. By continuing to inflame the situation and in prolonging the conflict, they are playing with the possibility of this war turning nuclear, a prospect that would mean the end of human civilization. So we welcome the chance to participate in this event alongside other leftists who understand that the central question is opposition to US-NATO imperialism. It is necessary to seek to regroup and reorganize those forces that are seriously committed to the difficult struggle to reforge a viable mass revolutionary workers' organization on an international basis. But this desire cannot be achieved by papering over significant programmatic issues in the interest of projecting a degree of unity which is not real. Comrades might have seen that at the beginning of the week, Left Voice called for a new Zimmerwald, on a different political basis, of course. And what we really need in this circumstance is a Zimmerwald left, based on intransigent opposition to imperialist aggression, whether directly or through its proxies. Such a formation would necessarily see that US-NATO aggression against Russia through the Ukrainian proxy is occurring in the wider framework of increasing imperialist hostility towards the Chinese deformed workers' state. For those unfamiliar with our organization, the Bolshevik Tendency stands in the tradition of the Revolutionary Spartacist League of the 1960s and 1970s. Before that organization's programmatic degeneration into the brain-dead obedience cult that it is today. So that revolutionary political heritage would frame any discussions on a more substantive unity from our point of view. For people wanting to know more about our wider programmatic perspectives, you can visit our website at Bolshevik Tendency, that's one word run together, bolsheviktendency.org. Thank you.